to make better sense of Immanuel Kant's Metaphysics, we'll have to look at his Epistemology, that is, his theory of knowledge. Now, Kant, he wrote a variety of works in epistemology, and the main one of this is The Critique of Pure Reason. Now, as Kant saw it, his work was a reaction to the dogmatic philosophy of his predecessors. And in this context, dogmatic is something of an insult, the idea being they kind of simply believe stuff, perhaps because of authority or for not particularly good reasons. Now, he uses the term critique in his Critique of Pure Reason because of the Greek roots of the word critique, which is, translated in English, of course, to sort or to sift out. Now, those who really like Kant present him as creating a Copernican revolution. Copernicus, of course, is the guy that is generally credited with developing and establishing this change from a geocentric view, the idea that the Earth is the center of the solar system, to a heliocentric view, that the Sun is the center of the solar system. So, what is his Copernican revolution? Well, much like the empiricists who say that whatever you know about the world comes in through the senses, Kant says, to quote him, translated into English of course, is that there can be no doubt that all our knowledge begins with experience. But of course, he doesn't just simply embrace empiricism, he also brings in some seemingly rationalistic aspects. To quote him again translated into English, but though all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it all arises out of experience. So, he's doing a Copernicus-style thing. And again, Copernicus proposed this revolution in astronomy, the Earth being replaced by the Sun as the center. So here's how Kant's Copernicus revolution in philosophy goes. The past empiricists assume that whatever we know must conform to the objects of knowledge. And according to Kant at least, and also critics like David Hume, all our efforts, that is to say all the efforts of past empiricists, to extend, to do this ended up failing. And all attempts to extend knowledge of objects by a priori means failed. In this context, a priori is, of course, prior to experience, and the idea would be that we'd know it prior to our experience. We'd know it by, say, pure reason or through innate ideas. Innate ideas, to use an analogy, it's like software pre-installed in the factory. That is to say, when we're created, if you accept like a, incorporeal version of the soul, whenever that's created, the stuff is in there. You can also have materialistic accounts of innate ideas. They're put in through, genetics or biology in some way. So, according to Kant, all efforts to, extend knowledge of objects by a priori means didn't work. Now, Hume, of course, is famous for arguing we have no way of establishing a conformity between the objects out in the world, if there are any such things, and the knowledge that we have. And it's a classic skeptical problem. Namely, going way back to the ancient skeptics, how do you know that what you seem to be experiencing is really real for real? And, the famous movie The Matrix is an example of that made into a movie. How do you know you're not in a virtual reality? Or the movie Inception. How do you know you're not in a dream within a dream within a dream within some more dreams? So what Kant does, believing that the past way is not going to work, he comes up with a Copernican solution. That is to say, he revolves this. So instead of saying, okay, we've got to approach it to see that our knowledge conforms to the object, he reverses this. He asserts that the objects of our knowledge correspond to our knowledge. What does this mean? Well, for our sensory data, the term used by philosophers, in perception and epistemology, is the term sense data, which is kind of exactly what it means, but put more informally, it's the feelings that we get from an example of sense data would be like the warmth we get from feeling the sun upon us, or visual data from what you see, or audio data from what you hear. Now, according to Kant, for this sense data, for this data input from our senses to be experienced as objects, our mind must impose a structure or ordering upon them. To use a modern metaphor that Kant obviously wouldn't be aware of, think about your smartphone. When you take a picture, what happens is, of course, is the photons are striking the sensors, and then converting that data into digital data in the form of zeros and ones stored in your phone. But of course, it has to process that, and what it does is process that and gives you an image, and then our minds are, according to Kant at least, again, not a metaphor he would use because he's unaware of computers, but using what Kant says, what we have to do is think of your eye as like the camera on your phone, and the data comes in, and your mind is processing it and imposing a structure and order upon it, transforming that just photons smacking you in the eye into an object. So how does this give us knowledge a priori? Well, according to Kant, that's how it would work, because the data comes in, that's the experience, and the mind has to structure or order that, and that is the a priori part. That structuring, that ordering is already in there. So, if our intuition must conform to the object, then we could never know anything about the supposed stuff out there a priori. Essentially, Kant is agreeing with the skeptics and Hume on this point. But his sort of clever way to beat it, again, is to reverse that, Copernican style. If the object of sense must conform to our faculty of intuition, then we can, according to him, know things a priori. Or that's what he claims. Some agree, some do not. So how does this connect to reality? Because one possibility to look at it would be, well, if our mind is doing all this processing, isn't it just creating reality? So isn't the skeptic right? We're just making all this up in our mind. Well, Kant addresses that problem. So he doesn't say the mind is creating reality, but the way reality appears to us depends on the senses and also the mind. So our minds impose its structure on experience, and this gives us the objects of knowledge. Now, normally we're not aware of this. We don't, metaphorically speaking, hear the gears, turning, etc. We're not aware of the process. We don't have to think of if you ever seen like a Polaroid camera. It takes a picture, and then the old ones you'd pull the photo out, and you have to wait for it to develop. So for Kant, it's not like that. It's not that you have to wait for your mind to do all the processing, etc. As soon as you have the experience, you already have imposed that structure. So this activity is going throughout all perception. So hearing my words, seeing the video, you're not aware of the processing. It just happens so quickly, in effect, that you don't even notice it. So any experience that you have, according to Kant, is a product of what you sense in the external world and the structure the mind imposes on it. So data comes in, you process it, and you don't even realize you're processing it unless something goes wrong, and then you have that experience, according to him at least. Now this entails that we can never compare reality as it appears to us to reality as it really is. So there's what's out there, which is one thing, and then we encounter that and our minds process it in order to, essentially to structure and order it. To use a metaphor analogy, again, that Kant wouldn't be aware of, think of like different types of cameras you might have seen in, real life, or more likely in movies, like infrared cameras or infrared goggles. Have you ever seen the original Predator movie? The way they do the Predator thing, the Predator sees like in, infrared, sees the heat. And so if you saw the world, say, like the Predator did, you'd be experiencing the same world as, as humans, but it would look different. And so the idea is that it's, think of those cameras, it's receiving the same, thing. We feel the warmth in our skin, that's kind of our infrared sensors. But other creatures, real creatures, can actually kind of, see the infrared. Now, how then do we avoid, some sort of relativity where everybody is experiencing different, stuff? Well, Kant's reasoning is this. If human minds have the same structure, then within our experience, it's possible to have knowledge that is objective and universal. To use another metaphor, think of like color. All the scientists and stuff tell us, color's not out there in the world. We just have an experience of photons, etc., hitting our eyes, and our minds, or brains, depending on how you look at it, provide the color. But we believe, perhaps incorrectly, that all humans, unless they have, like color blindness, etc., they see the same basic thing. So technically, color is not out there, but we can all objectively say, that is, that object is green. Again, not a perfect metaphor, but would be an example of how you could have, something that's entirely, well, the experience, part of it is in your mind, and caused by something out there, but still say like it's objectively green. And of course, people, when you use the example color, people would go and argue against that as being objective, etc. But that's just intended to illustrate that. So that's sort of the basic parts of his theory of knowledge, at least the beginnings of it. And again, as I mentioned, this is something that leads into his metaphysics and leads in some critical stuff for that. So one of the things that Kant is well known for is his view of varieties of judgment. And some of this will be found in many other philosophers who agree with sort of the basic distinctions, and other parts of it will be kind of unique to Kant. So what are the types of judgments he considers? Well, first are what are called analytic judgments. And these are based on the principle of contradiction. And the principle of contradiction is this. The idea is that contradictions are, roughly put, are false, and false, in virtue of their logical structure. They're never true. And so an analytical judgment is such that if it's true, then its contradiction is necessarily false. So to deny a true analytical judgment would result in something that is of necessity false. That means it's, talk about possible worlds, it's false in all possible worlds. It's never true because it cannot be true. What would be an example of this? Well, one example would be triangles have three sides. So if you say, to try to, contradict it, triangles do not have three sides, or in that case, that would necessarily be false. So its denial would be a contradiction. Because you'd be saying essentially the three-sided figure is not three-sided. Now, that part most people, philosophers, kind of agree with. Most philosophers accept the notion of that contradictions are always false. And they do accept that in general there are some claims that if you were to deny them, create a contradiction, the contradiction would of course be necessarily false. So what are the parts of it that are kind of controversial? Well, one is this, The predicate, according to Kant, in such a judgment is contained in the subject. Now, in this context, it's basically the way it's done in kind of standard English classes. The subject is what you're talking about. The predicate is the quality you're attributing to it. So if you say the triangle has 3 sides, then the subject would be triangle, predicate, 3 sides. Now, kind of the problem here, the controversy here, is this metaphor of containment. We have a pretty good idea what it would be for, say, a water bottle to contain water, a backpack to contain books, a smartphone to contain an app. But what it is for a subject to contain a predicate, later critics say this is just an empty metaphor. And it relies very heavily on this metaphor, and so that's a standard critique of this notion. Now, in the case of analytic judgments, the general view, one also held by Kant, is that the truth of an analytic judgment does not depend on facts and doesn't give you any knowledge about the world. So, a true analytic judgment is true, and always true, but it tells you nothing about, the world itself, like what exists. To use kind of a silly example, a billigon, we'll define that as a billion-sided figure, and so if someone says, the billion-sided figure, the billigon, is not billion-sided, that would be, a contradiction. The billion-sided figure is not billion-sided. And we know that it's true that billion-sided figures are billion-sided, but it doesn't tell us if such a thing exists. So that would be, kind of an example of an analytical judgment that tells us nothing about the world. Another example, if we say, for example, that bachelors are unmarried by definition. And of course, that doesn't tell us, knowing that that's the case, that would be a contradiction to say that a bachelor is married. It doesn't tell us if a particular person is married or not. So what if we want to, have judgments about what is and what is not, in the world? Well, that takes us to synthetic judgments. According to Kant, these give us knowledge about the world. In another metaphor, they synthesize the subject with the predicate. And again, critics would say, what does that even mean? Now, one of the hallmarks of synthetic judgments, again, it's kind of a, when you first hear it, it sounds kind of like an odd term, because you might think of like synthetic, fabrics like polyester, or synthetic, foods or flavoring. But it gets synthetic because it's from the synthesize. Again, whatever that means. Now, the hallmark of a synthetic judgment, in addition to giving us knowledge about the world, if you deny a true synthetic judgment, you would, of course, be making a mistake. You'd be saying something untrue, but it wouldn't give you a contradiction. So, for example, if you say that Ted is a bachelor, suppose that's true, but it's denied. Someone says, no, Ted's not a bachelor. Well, it doesn't yield a contradiction, because there's nothing about Ted that is, necessarily connected to his being a bachelor. So you can't know from, the fact that Ted is Ted, that Ted would be a bachelor. Now, it could be true of him, but again, it doesn't yield a contradiction. So claims that are true about the world, in this case, that are synthetic judgments, don't give contradictions. So you would be wrong if you deny a true claim, but you wouldn't be able to know that something was not true just in the case of a synthetic judgment by pure application of this principle of contradiction. Continuing with our varieties of judgment, I mentioned earlier the notion of the a priori. So far we've had the analytic, where you can analyze, that the subject contains the predicate, again, whatever that means. And then synthetic judgments, there's a synthesis of subject and predicate, again, whatever that means. So, in terms of knowledge, most philosophers agree there is a priori knowledge, prior to experience. And this is knowledge that you can acquire without experience. Analytic judgments would be a priori. You would get them, without experience, sensory experience. Now, people might bring up, well, you'd have to know like math and geometry and stuff to talk about this, which would be, true. But the idea is you wouldn't have to go and look to see if a triangle is three-sided. You know that without looking at triangles. And you could say, well, you have to take geometry, etc. But they're not claiming that you don't learn about triangles by experience. It's that once you understand what a triangle is, you'd know a priori it's three-sided. Now, there's also a posteriori knowledge. Posterior meaning after experience. This is knowledge you get through experience. So you would know, say for example, I say I'm drawing a triangle right now, which you can't see. And then I ask, how many sides does it have? Well, you would know a priori, without even looking at it, that it has three sides, because it's a triangle. But to know if I actually drew one, you'd have to look, because maybe I did, maybe I did not. So why bring up the synthetic, analytic, a priori, a posteriori? Well, Kant combines these together. And again, this is all leading to his concerns about metaphysics, about what is real. So the first combination is the analytic a priori. These are based on the principle of non-contradiction. What would be examples? Well, according to Kant, it'd be things like all bodies are extended. Why would that be analytic? Well, if you analyze, according to Kant, again, whatever that could possibly mean, you would have the definition of body as an extended entity. So, in a sense, it's saying all extended entities are extended. Another example, the classic, of course, all bachelors are unmarried. Because, by definition, bachelors are unmarried. And so it'd be like saying all unmarried, people are unmarried. Second, the analytic a posteriori. According to Kant, and quite obviously, there are none of these. Analytic judgments are not based in experience, so none of that stuff. The synthetic a posteriori, these are judgments based in experience. This would, of course, include scientific judgments, things like the mass of the sun, the genetic makeup of a virus, those sorts of things. Next is the synthetic a priori. And this is what Kant really, really, really wants. Because these are judgments that are a priori, that is, say, prior to experience, and, you don't get them from the senses. But the critical thing is, they give us knowledge about the world. And this may not seem like a big deal, but for Kant, this is, I guess as Joe Biden would say, well, I can't quote Joe Biden because, have to bleep that out. This is a big deal. Because they're a priori judgments that tell you about the world. For example, for Kant, the claim all events have a cause would be synthetic a priori. Namely, it tells you something about the world, that all events have a cause, but according to Kant, it would be a priori, prior to experience. Now, so why do this? Well, Kant was influenced by our good dead friend David Hume, and Hume argued that no matter how much experience you have, you can't get what Kant claims is synthetic a priori. You can't have knowledge a priori that tells you about the world. So how does Kant do this? Well, some might say it involves either brilliance or some cheating, or brilliant cheating. He claims that we bring the information to our experience of the world, and we don't derive it from experience. So it's a priori knowledge. We already have it in a way, but it also tells us about the world. So unlike analytical judgments, synthetic a priori judgments give us knowledge about this world. So how would that kind of work, and what would be examples? Well, Kant gives two main examples involving mathematics and geometry, which you might say is just more math. So Kant contends that math is synthetic a priori. Now, pretty much almost everyone in philosophy and mathematics agrees that math is a priori. Yeah, obviously you have to learn about numbers and the symbols, and you take math, etc. But the idea is that you don't learn the math stuff through sensory experience. And once you get like the basics down, then you're doing it a priori. Again, we have to distinguish between how do you learn about how do you learn about mathematics and numbers, and what is the reasoning that's going on there. So most people regard math as a priori. Not everyone. Some people have tried to argue for empirical foundations for mathematics. They generally never work, though. So we can know a priori, according to Kant and most philosophers, that 7 plus 5 equals 12 is a universal and necessary truth. So how is that this, synthetic a priori? Well, what he claims is this. He claims you cannot analyze the concepts of 5, 7, and their union and find that they explicitly contain the concept of 12. And again, one major problem with this is that Kant is relying so heavily on this analysis concept. And later philosophers come along and are very critical of it and say, what does that even mean? Second example he gives in the case of geometry. Geometric judgments, according to him, are synthetic a priori. How does he argue for this? Well, he gives an example. One thing that we know, supposedly, is that a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. But, according to him, the concept straight refers only to the quality of the line and does not contain quantitative concepts such as shortest. So you can't do it through analysis, but you know it a priori. So its truth is known without experience, but it tells us about the world. And again, critics would tend to say, what is this analysis? What does containment even mean? And later thinkers like Quine, he wrote a famous piece called Two Dogmas of Empiricism, and went after this notion. And other philosophers have said containment is just ironically an empty metaphor. So Kant sets himself the following goal. He believes that in order to do math, physics, morality, and very importantly, metaphysics, you've got to be able to do the synthetic a priori judgments. That is to say, you can't do math, physics, metaphysics, and morality without having a priori truths. But of course, if they don't tell us anything about the world, then they're not particularly, well, they'd still be interesting, but not particularly, useful. So he wants to make the world safe for the synthetic a priori, so that way we can know mathematics, physics, metaphysics, and morality.